The first thing that went wrong at Ravenshallow that autumn was so small that only I noticed it. A young woman's gloved hand closing too hard around the grip of a shotgun while she smiled for the guns. Everyone else was watching the birds. I was watching the hand. My name is Emrys Thorne, and for 11 years I served as a corporal of the household guard of Harrogate, which is another way of saying that my whole trade was learning to stand still and see. A guardsman is not paid to move. He is paid to notice the one wrong note in a hall full of music, and to already be moving toward it before the music stops. That morning at the lodge, standing at the low stone wall above the shooting butts with my rifle slung and my breath steaming in the cold, I noticed the wrong note and did not yet know how loud it would become. The wrong note was the Lady Verena. She was the Queen Consort's daughter, a young woman of 20 who had grown up in the certainty that the world owed her a throne it had not promised her, and she was, that morning, losing. It was only a shoot, a driven day at the King's Autumn Lodge. Guests strung along the butts while beaters worked the coverts and pheasants came over high and fast. But for the Lady Verena everything was a contest, and she was being beaten in front of the whole party by a boy of 11. The boy was Prince Torin. I should tell you about Torin, because everything I did that autumn I did for him, and a man ought to know what he was standing for. He was the second son of the late Queen Isolde, King Alaric's first wife, who had died 3 winters before of a fever that took her in 9 days and left the whole realm grayer for it. Torin had her eyes a grave water gray that seemed always to be listening, and her habit of going quiet in a crowd, and her gift, which everyone remarked on and no one could quite explain, of making a servant feel seen. He was not a loud child. He was the kind who stood a half step back and watched, the way I watched, which is perhaps why I had a soft place for him that I would not have admitted to my sergeant. That morning Torin shot well. He shot better than any boy his age had a right to, calm and unhurried, folding his birds cleanly and lowering the little 16-bore his brother had taught him on as though he were ashamed to be good at it. And every time he took a bird, the Lady Verena's smile grew a shade tighter, because she had missed 3 in a row and the visiting guests had begun, in the polite murmuring way of such people, to notice. "Beginner's fortune," she said, loud enough to carry, when Torin took a difficult high bird that had beaten 2 grown men down the line. "It evens out. It always evens out." Torin did not answer. He broke his gun and looked at the ground. It was the Crown Prince who answered, Prince Rowan, the eldest, 21, and already carrying himself like the king he would one day be. He stood 2 pegs down with his loader beside him, and he said, without turning his head, "It's not fortune, cousin. It's that he practices. A small thing. A brother's thing. But I saw the Lady Verena's jaw set, and I marked it, the way I marked everything, and filed it away in the long cold ledger a guardsman keeps of who is likely to become dangerous and when. I want to be careful, telling this, not to make her a monster from the first minute. She was not born cruel. I have thought about the Lady Verena a great deal in the years since, more than is comfortable, and I have come to believe she was made cruel by a mother who taught her that love was a thing you won by winning, and that a person who was losing was a person who deserved to lose. Her mother was the Queen Consort Morwenna, and Morwenna had married a grieving king and spent 3 years since making very sure that her own 2 children, Verena and her brother, Lord Cassius, stood always a little nearer the sun than the late Queen Isolde's 3. It is an old story in old houses. It is usually told in whispers and settled in wills. It is not usually told, as this one came to be, with a shot fired across a frozen lake. But I run ahead of myself. The shoot ended at noon. The party walked back to the lodge across the frosted park with the dogs weaving among them and the keepers carrying the birds, and I fell in at my proper distance behind the royal children, where a guardsman walks near enough to reach, far enough not to intrude. Ravenshallow Lodge sat at the head of a long dark water the country people called the Mere, a lake perhaps a half-mile long, fed by hill streams and edged with reed and old alders, with a boathouse of gray stone at its foot, where the late queen had liked to sit. The king had brought the whole household north for a fortnight of it. The shooting, the last of the autumn, a chance for the children to run in country air before the winter shut them into the palace at Harrogate. King Alaric himself was not there that first week. Affairs of state had kept him in the capital, and he had sent word he would come north by the week's end. In his absence the household belonged, as it too often did, to the Queen Consort. I remember the lodge that noon. Wood smoke, the smell of the birds, the long hall with its staghorns and its fire, the guests peeling off gloves and calling for hot wine, and the two factions of that strange blended family arranging themselves at the table without ever seeming to. Morwen as children on the warm side of the hearth. Isolde's children Rowan and Torin, and the little one Prince Bram, who was 6 and understood none of it on the cold side, near the door near me. There was one other adult at that table who did not belong to either faction, and I should name her too, because she is part of how this ends. The Princess Adela was the king's own sister, a woman near 50, unmarried, plain-spoken, who had buried a husband young, and since then had made herself the conscience of the house. Morwen feared her the way a cheat fears an honest witness. Adela had come north with the children because, she said, someone with sense ought to, and she sat that noon at the cold end of the table with Bram on her knee and her sharp eyes going round the room. And once, as the wine went round, her eyes met mine and she gave me the smallest nod. It meant, watch them. I gave her the smallest nod back. It meant, I am. I have been asked since whether I knew that day what was coming. I did not. No man knows the shape of a thing before it happens. But I knew the weather of the house, the way an old soldier knows the weather of a sky, and the weather of the house of Harrogate that autumn was the low green light that comes before hail. Something was going to break. I did not know it would be a child's heart, and then very nearly a child's body, and that I would be the one holding the rifle when it did. The break began that afternoon over nothing, over a horse, of all things. The late Queen Isolde had kept a grey mare called Fen, a gentle, aging thing she had ridden as a girl, and after her death the mare had been sent north to Ravenshallow to live out her years in the lodge paddocks. Torin loved that mare with the fierce, private love a grieving child gives to anything that still smells of the parent he has lost. He went to her every afternoon. He would take her an apple and stand with his forehead against her neck and say nothing, and I would stand at the paddock gate at my proper distance and pretend to watch the tree line, and something in me that I do not often let move would move. That afternoon, the Lady Verena was at the paddock before him. I came up the path behind Torin and saw them from 30 paces, Verena inside the rail with a riding crop in her hand, and the grey mare backed into the corner with her ears flat and her eyes rolling white, and Verena laughing, driving the old horse round, and round the small paddock at a trot she was too stiff and frightened to hold. She was no horsewoman. She had climbed the rail to prove she could ride the dead queen's mare, and the mare, gentle as she was, had felt the fear and the crop and gone sour, and now it was a bad business. A heavy, half-panicked old horse in a small space, and a young woman who had lost her nerve and would not admit it, using the crop harder to hide that she was afraid. Torin saw it and made a sound I will not forget, a small broken no, and started to climb the rail. I moved. I was over the fence and had him by the collar of his coat and set back down on the safe side before he had got one leg across, and I said low, the way you speak to a spooked creature of any age, "Not in there, sir. Not while she's frightened. You'll be trampled, and then who takes Fen her apple?" He fought me for 1 second, just one, with his whole small, furious body, and then he stopped, because he was a reasonable child even in grief, and he stood shaking at the rail with his fists closed. "She's hurting her," he said. "Make her stop, she's hurting my mother's horse." "I know it," I said, and I raised my voice, not much, only enough, the voice we are trained to find, that carries without shouting, and I said, "My lady, drop the crop and come out through the near gate. The mare's too old to drive. She'll go down and take you with her." Verena rounded on me. I remember her face very clearly, framed against the gray autumn light, flushed with the cold and with something hotter, the particular fury of a person who has been caught being frightened and hates the witness for it. "You do not give me orders, guardsman," she said. "No, my lady," I said. "I give you good advice, and the mare's too old to argue with. The gate's behind you." For a moment I thought she would strike the horse again out of pure spite, to show me she chose it and I had not made her. But the mare chose that moment to buck, one heavy, arthritic, terrified heave. And Verena's nerve broke at last, and she scrambled for the gate and came out white and furious. And the mare stood in her corner blowing, unhurt but trembling. And Torin ducked under the rail the instant it was safe and went to her, and put his forehead against her neck, and I saw his shoulders shake. Verena stood on the safe side of the rail and watched the boy comfort the horse, and I watched Verena, and I saw a thing pass over her face that I have never been able to name kindly. It was not shame. It was closer to hunger. She had been frightened and shamed inside that rail, and here was a child who had witnessed it and who loved something openly, without defenses. And she wanted, I think, to take that from him, the way a person aching in the cold wants to put out a fire that is warming someone else. "That animal," she said, "is a broken-down old nag that should have been put down 2 winters ago. My mother says so. It costs the estate to feed, and it's dangerous, and now it's tried to kill me." She was breathing hard. "I shall tell her it wants shooting, and she'll agree. She agrees with me." Torin lifted his head from the mare's neck. His face had gone very still, Isolde's stillness, the listening stillness, and very white. "You leave Fen alone," he said, and his voice was steady, which was somehow worse than if it had shaken. "She was my mother's. You leave everything that was my mother's alone." "Or what?" said Verena, and she smiled. "You'll cry." I could have ended it there with a word Adela would have. The crown prince would have, but I was a guardsman, and it was not my place to enter a quarrel of the blood, only to keep it from turning to harm, and no harm was being done that I could put my hand on. So I did what my whole trade had taught me to do. I stood a half-step nearer, and I let my stillness say the thing I could not, that the boy was not alone, that there was a man between him and the world, and that the man was watching. Verena felt it. She always felt it. She gave me a look of pure loathing, turned on her heel, and walked back toward the lodge, striking the top rail of the paddock once with the crop as she passed, a small vicious crack that made the mare flinch all over again. Torin did not cry then. He waited until she was gone, and until I had come to stand beside him at the rail, and then he said, without looking at me, in a very small voice, "Was I a coward for not going in?" "No, sir," I said. "You listen to a man who knows horses. That's not cowardice. That's the beginning of command." He thought about that. He was a child who thought about things. "My mother would have known what to do," he said. "Your mother," I said, "would have done exactly what you did. She'd have listened to her guardsmen." I do not know if it was true. It might have been. Isolde had been a listener too. But I saw the words land and hold him up a little, the way a hand under the elbow holds up a man who has stumbled, and I have never been sorry I said them. We walked back to the lodge together in the failing light, the boy and the man, at no proper distance at all. And behind us the old gray mare put her head over the rail and watched us go. And I did not know, how could I have known, that I had just seen, in miniature in a paddock over a horse, the whole shape of the thing that was coming. The Lady Verena, frightened and shamed, wanting to break something that a grieving child loved. The child, steady past his years, guarding his mother's memory with the only weapons he had. And me, between them, a half-step nearer, watching a hand close too hard around a thing it should not have been holding. It would not be a crop the next time. It would not be a horse. But that was 3 days off, and there was a great deal of ordinary cruelty to get through first. That evening I learned why the Queen Consort had brought her whole household north, and it was not for the shooting. I learned it the way a guardsman learns most things, by standing in a doorway holding a lamp while important people spoke as though I were furniture. Morwenna held court after supper in the small oak parlor off the great hall, and I was posted at the door, and so I heard the whole of it, though I was not meant to hear it as a man, only to be present as a fixture. She was a handsome woman, the Queen Consort, in the hard, bright way of a coin that has been polished too often. You could see your face in her and never once feel warmed. She sat by the fire with a document across her knees and her son Lord Cassius at her shoulder, and she spoke, in the low, pleased voice of someone laying out a winning hand, of the estate. I did not follow all of it, I am no lawyer, but the shape of it was this. The late Queen Isolde had left in her own hand a settlement of certain properties and moneys upon her 3 children, a northern estate, the very lodge we sat in, some jewels, the grey mare's paddocks, a scattering of things that were hers and meant to pass to hers. And Morwenna had spent 3 years and a great deal of cleverness working to have that settlement set aside, to have it declared clouded, contested, improperly witnessed, so that all of it might fall instead into the general estate of the king, where she, as consort, had the ordering of things. The fortnight at Ravenshallow was not a holiday. It was a survey. She had brought lawyers dressed as guests. She meant to go home able to say that the lodge and its lands were hers to dispose of, and Isolde's children would have their allowances and their titles, and not one stone of the north that their mother had meant them to have. And the boy, said Cassius. Lord Cassius was 23, heavy where his sister was sharp, a young man who had never in his life been told no by anyone he could not walk away from. Torin, he's her favorite of the 3, the little gray ghost. He'll make trouble when he's grown. When he's grown, said Morwenna, he'll be a younger son with a younger son's portion and no lodge to run to and no horses to weep over, and he'll learn what the rest of us learned, that this house belongs to whoever is standing in it when the king is elsewhere. She looked at the fire. Isolde is dead. The dead do not hold property. It is only sentiment that pretends they do, and I have never in my life met a sentiment I could not outlast. I stood in the doorway with my lamp and my face made of wood, and I thought about the boy at the paddock rail with his forehead against a horse, and I thought, so that is the weather. That is what is coming. They mean to take the north from him, and the horse with it, and the last few things in the world that still smell of his mother, and they mean to do it lawfully over 3 years, with lawyers dressed as guests. And there is nothing a corporal of the household guard can do about a will. I was wrong about that as it happened, but not in any way I would have chosen. I should tell you now the thing I have not told you, the thing that made me more than a fixture in that doorway, because you have a right to know why my hand was steady 3 days later when a great many hands would have shaken. I had known the late Queen Isolde. Not as a friend, a corporal does not befriend a queen, but as a man knows the officer who once did him a decency he did not have to do. 11 years before, when I was a raw recruit of 19, and had made a fool's mistake on parade that could have ended my service before it began. I had fainted, if you want the truth of it, locked my knees on a hot day at a long ceremony, and gone down like a dropped rifle in front of the whole court. It had been Isolde, then a young queen newly come to the throne beside Alaric, who had stopped the sergeant from breaking me. She had sent for me afterward, a shaking boy expecting disgrace, and she had said, "A man who can be broken by the sun can be taught to master the sun. Give him to the marksman. Steady hands are wasted on fainting." And they had sent me to the marksman, and I had found there the one thing in the world I was truly good at, the stillness, the breath, the long patience of the rifle, and I had risen, and I had made a life, all because a young queen had chosen to see a frightened boy as a thing worth mending rather than a thing worth discarding. She would not have remembered it a year later. Queens do 100 such kindnesses and forget them all, but I did not forget it. A man does not forget the hour someone decided he was worth keeping. And when she died and her children came under the cold hand of the woman who took her place, I made myself a private promise, the kind of promise a plain man makes and tells no one, that whatever I could not give the mother I would give the son. If I could not mend the will, I could at least stand a half step nearer the boy. It was not much. It was what I had. So you will understand why, over the next 2 days, as the ordinary cruelty ground on, I did not look away. And it was ordinary, at first, the small daily weather of a house where one faction has decided another faction does not matter. Torin was left off the list for the day's outing to the falconry, and only remembered loudly as an afterthought, so that he had to be seen to be included after being seen to be forgotten. His place at the table drifted 1 seat further from the fire each meal, as though by the tide. A tutor's lesson he had prepared for was cancelled without word, and the hour given to Cassius's amusements. None of it was a blow. All of it was a message, and the message was, "You are less. Your mother is dead and you are less, and every day we will find a small new way to say so." Torin bore it the way I have seen good soldiers bear a long shelling, by going quiet, by getting through the hour, by finding one thing to hold to. His one thing was the mare and the boathouse. The boathouse at the foot of the mere had been Isolde's place. I had this from Adela, who told me a great many things in her sharp offhand way, standing beside me at windows. The late queen had come to Ravenshallow as a girl, before ever she was queen, and the grey stone boathouse at the water's edge, with its little jetty and its 2 old rowing boats and its bench where you could sit out of the wind and watch the light move on the mere, had been her place to be no one, to be a girl and not a queen in waiting. She had brought Torin there as a small child before her death, in the one northern summer they had shared, and taught him to skip stones off the black water, and told him, he said once, that the mere was the oldest quiet thing she knew. After she died, the boathouse became his. He went there the way I went to the rifle range, to find the one place where the noise stopped. I did not like the mere. I will say that plainly because it matters to what came after. It was a deep cold water, spring-fed, and it froze early and treacherously. That autumn had come in hard, and by the second night the shallow reed-fringed foot of the lake, near the boathouse jetty, had skimmed over with a first skin of ice, that gray, deceiving early ice that looks solid from the bank and will not hold a cat, that lies thickest where the water is shallowest and thins to nothing over the deep channel 3 strides out. The keepers had put a warning board at the boathouse steps. I had read it, and I had marked in my cold ledger that a grieving boy who liked to sit alone at the water's edge and a first skin of false ice were 2 facts that ought never to be in the same sentence, and I had resolved to keep half an eye on the foot of the mere. There was a third fact I put in the same ledger, and it is the one that made the difference. They were wildfowling at the mere in the evenings. Lord Cassius and 2 of the visiting guests had taken to walking down to the lake at dusk to shoot the duck that came into the water off the hill. A rough evening sport, cold and quick, standing among the alders at the lake's edge as the light died and the birds came in over the reeds. It meant that in the last hour of every day there were loaded guns at the foot of the mere, and men who had drunk their afternoon wine handling them, and a rack of spare pieces left leaning in the boathouse porch where the flighting party assembled. I did not like that either. A guardsman never likes loaded guns and wine and idle young men in the same half-mile. But it was not my sport to forbid, and Cassius was the consort's son, and I was a corporal, and so I did the only thing my rank allowed. On the evenings I could contrive it, I posted myself down near the boathouse under the excuse of watching the children's paths, and I kept those loaded guns in the corner of my eye the way you keep a fire in the corner of your eye in a house full of tapestries. On the second evening I was there, and Torin came down to the boathouse in the last gray light, while Cassius and his friends were away up the reeds after the duck, and he sat on his mother's bench with his knees drawn up and looked at the water, and I stood back among the alders where he could not see me and let him have his quiet. It was very still. The false ice at the lake's foot had a faint sheen on it in the last light. Somewhere up the reeds a gun went off, and then another, flat cracks that rolled across the water and came back off the far hill, and a knot of duck lifted and wheeled black against the dying sky. And Torin sat and watched, and I watched Torin, and for the length of that half hour nothing in the whole cold world was wrong. Then the lady Verena came down the path to the boathouse, and everything that was going to be wrong began. She had not come to shoot. She had come, I think, because she had seen him go, and because a person who is losing cannot bear to see a person who is losing find one quiet place to be at peace. She came down the path in her fur-collared coat with her hands in her pockets, and she stopped at the boathouse steps and read the warning board about the ice aloud, in a bright mocking voice, as though it were a very funny thing. "Danger, thin ice, keep off the mere," she read. "How thrilling! And here's the little ghost sitting at the haunted lake all alone. Don't you know it's dangerous, Torin? Doesn't your guardsman know?" She looked round, and did not see me among the alders, and I stayed where I was, still as the stone of the boathouse, because a guardsman who reveals himself too soon loses the one advantage he has, which is that the dangerous do not perform for a witness they cannot see. Torin did not answer her. He had learned by then that answering fed her. "I'm talking to you," said Verena, and came down onto the little jetty, her boots loud on the old planks. "You outshot me this morning, and you made me look a fool at the paddock, and you sit here at my lake. It's my mother's lake now, you know, or it will be. She's having the papers drawn. You sit here at my lake, and you won't even answer when I speak to you. You really are your mother's son. She never knew when she wasn't wanted either." And there it was, the first cut that was not ordinary. I felt it go through the boy from 30 feet away. He came up off the bench. "Don't talk about my mother," he said. "Why not?" said Verena. "Everyone else has stopped. That's the thing about the dead, Torin. The whole world agrees to stop talking about them, and then one morning they're just gone, out of every conversation like they were never." "Stop it," said Torin, and his voice cracked, and I began very quietly to move. I did not move fast. I want to be exact about this, because later a great many people would ask me to account for every second of that fortnight, and I found that I could. I moved the way a guardsman moves when there is not yet a hand to put on the trouble, slowly, out of the alders, along the bank, closing the distance without seeming to, so that when I chose to be seen I would be near enough to matter. Verena had not touched him. She had only spoken, and speaking, however cruel, is not a thing a corporal may put his hands on. So I closed the ground and waited for the line, the one I would know when I saw it, and I hoped I would not see it. Verena saw the boy's face crack, and she did what her mother had taught her. She pressed the wound. "Go on and cry then," she said, softer now, which was worse, coming down off the jetty a step toward him. "That's what you're best at, isn't it? Not the shooting, the crying. The little gray ghost who cries for his dead mother at the dead mother's lake. Do you know what my mother says? She says Isolde is the reason this house is so gloomy. She says the kindest thing that ever happened to you children was—" Torin broke. "I have stood at deathbeds, and I have carried men off fields, and I have heard, in my time, a great many kinds of grief, and I tell you there is no sound in the world quite like a proud child's guard coming down all at once. He did not weep like a small boy. He wept like a man who has held a wall alone for 3 years, and felt it finally go, great silent heaving breaths with the tears running and no sound but the breath, his fist still closed, still trying even then to stand. He turned half away from her toward the water so she would not have the satisfaction of his face, and that turn toward the water was the thing that put the ice in the story, though none of us knew it yet. And he stood on the edge of his mother's jetty and broke down in tears in the last gray light, while the Queen Consort's daughter watched him do it and smiled. That was my line, not a blow, a smile. A grown woman smiling at a weeping child at the edge of deep water. I did not need a hand laid on him. I stepped out of the dusk. "My lady!" I did not raise my voice. I did not have to. I was 10 feet away, and she had not known I was there, and the sound of a man's voice where she had thought there was no one turned her round white and fast. "The board says thin ice and the light's near gone. His Highness is wanted at the lodge, and so, I think, are you. Step back from the jetty if you please. The planks are old and the water's cold, and I'd not have either of you nearer it than you are." For a moment, one long moment, I did not know which way she would jump. She was flushed with the pleasure of the cruelty and the shock of the witness, and both of those are wild things in a young person who has never been checked. But I had done the one thing that steadies such a moment. I had given her a way to leave that was not a defeat. His Highness is wanted at the lodge, and so are you. Not you have done a wicked thing. Not step away from the child you are tormenting. Only, you are both wanted. The ice is dangerous, come away. A door held open. Most people, even cruel ones, will walk through a door that is held open rather than climb the wall beside it. She walked through it. She gave me a look, the paddock look, the loathing, and she said, "You were listening. You were hiding in the trees and listening like a spy." And I said, "I was watching the water, my lady, as I'm posted to," which was true enough, and she tossed her head and went up the path toward the lodge fast, her boots loud on the frozen ground. And I was left on the jetty with a boy who was still weeping, and I did the thing that is not in any guardsman's manual, and is the whole of the trade all the same. I did not touch him. A corporal does not lay hands on a prince, but I took off my greatcoat and I put it round his shoulders, heavy and warm and smelling of leather and cold, and I stood beside him at no proper distance at all while he got his breath back, and I said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not be smaller than the thing he was feeling. The mere lay black and still. The last of the duck came in over the reeds. Somewhere up the water Cassius's flighting party fired again, 2 flat cracks and a rolling echo, and Torin flinched at the sound, and I put my hand. I did lay a hand on him then, on his shoulder through the coat, and I have never been sorry for that either. I put my hand on his shoulder and I said, "I have you, sir. You're not alone at this water. You were never alone at this water. Breathe." And he breathed, and after a while the weeping stopped, the way weather stops, and he wiped his face with the heel of his hand in the fierce, embarrassed way of a boy who has been seen crying, and he said, "You won't tell anyone." "There's nothing to tell," I said, "but that the light went and I walked you both up from a dangerous water. That's my whole report, sir, and it's true." He looked up at me then in the near dark, and I saw his mother's gray eyes red-rimmed and steady, and he said a thing I have carried with me every day since. He said, "She said the world stops talking about the dead. Did you ever know my mother?" And I found I could not lie to him. "I did, sir," I said, "once. She was young and I was younger, and I'd made a fool of myself on parade, fainted dead away in front of the whole court, and everyone was for breaking me, and she stopped them. She said a man who could be broken by the sun could be taught to master it, and she sent me to the marksman, and that's how I come to be the man standing next to you now, holding a rifle instead of pushing a broom. So you see, sir, the world hasn't stopped talking about your mother. I talk about her. I've talked about her to no one in 3 years, and I'm talking about her now to you, and I'll go on talking about her as long as there's a man alive who was mended by her. That's what the dead have. They have the people they mended. You're one, and so am I." He did not cry again. Something in him went very still and very old, and he nodded once, the way his brother nodded, the way a king nods, and he handed me back my coat with great care, and we walked up to the lodge together in the dark, and I thought the worst of it was over. It was not the worst of it. It was the middle, and the middle turned, as middles do, on the person you least expect, not on Verena at all, but on her mother. Because Verena, going up that path fast and white and shamed, did not go to her room to nurse it as I had supposed. She went to the Queen Consort, and she told her story first, and she told it well, and by the time I had walked Torin up and seen him safe to his brother's care and gone to make my quiet report to the captain of the guard as duty required, the story had already set hard in the shape Verena poured it, and it was this: that the guardsman Thorne had crept about in the dark spying on the lady Verena, had spoken to her insolently, and given her orders no guardsman had the standing to give, had frightened her at the water's edge and laid hands upon the prince, and had generally forgotten his place in a manner that could not be borne. I learned how hard it had set when the captain of the guard, a decent, tired man named Osric Vane, who had no love of the consort and less power to resist her, came to find me at my quarters near midnight with his cap in his hand and trouble in his face. "Thorne," he said, "I've had the Queen Consort steward at me for an hour. You're to be taken off the children." I said nothing. There is nothing to say to the first blow but to take it standing. "It's not my doing and it's not my wish," said Vane, "and I told the steward as much, and it made no odds. She wants you off the young ones and posted to the outer gates, the far post, where you'll see nothing but the road and the crows." The word she used was overfamiliar. She said a corporal who takes a prince's part in a family matter and speaks so to a lady of the house has forgotten what a corporal is. He looked at me, and I saw he believed not one word of it and could do not one thing about it. "Is it true you laid hands on the boy?" "I put my coat round him because he was cold and weeping," I said, "and my hand on his shoulder because a gun went off up the water and he flinched, and I told him he wasn't alone. If that's the crime, sir, I did it, and I'd do it again tonight." Vane was quiet a moment. Then he said, "Between us, Thorne, and it stays between us, that's the least offense I've heard a man broken for in 20 years. But she's the consort and the king's away, and the king's away is the whole of it. You know how this house runs when he's away." He put his cap back on. "Outer gate, first light, I'm sorry." So that was the midpoint of it, if you want to give a soldier's plain life the shape of a story. It changed the whole game, and it changed it exactly the way the consort meant it to. She had not disciplined her daughter for tormenting a grieving child at the edge of deep water. She had disciplined the man who stopped it, and posted him a half-mile off at the outer gate where he could see nothing. And in doing so she had taught her daughter the lesson her daughter had been learning her whole life, that cruelty carries no cost, that the strong write the report, and that the one man who might stand between the Lady Verena and the next thing she wanted to do had just been marched to the road to count crows. I lay awake that night in my cold quarters and I thought about it, turning it the way you turn a jammed round to see why it will not seat. And the thing that would not let me sleep was not the injustice to me. A guardsman signs for injustice the day he takes the coat. It was the arithmetic of it. Verena, humiliated a second time now, and humiliated in a way that had been briefly checked and would leave her hungrier, not tamer. A boy who wept at a boathouse. Loaded guns down at that boathouse every dusk while young men drank and shot the flighting duck. A skin of false ice at the foot of the mere over 3 strides of deep cold water. And me, the one man who had put those 4 facts in one ledger, and resolved to keep half an eye on them, me, posted to the outer gate at first light, a half-mile off, where I would see nothing but the road and the crows. I did not sleep. I have never been more glad in all my life of a night I did not sleep. The outer gate of Ravenshallow stood a half-mile from the lodge at the head of the drive, an old iron thing between 2 stone pillars with a crow-haunted avenue of limes running down to the road, and it was, as Vane had promised, a post from which a man could see nothing that mattered. I took it at first light without a word, because a guardsman takes his post, and I stood in the cold and watched the road and turned the arithmetic over and waited, though I could not have told you for what. It was Adela who came to me, mid-morning, walking down the lime avenue alone with her breath smoking, and her plain dark coat buttoned to the chin. She came right up to the gate and looked at me through the bars for a moment as though pricing a horse, and then she said, without any greeting, "They've posted the wrong man to the gate." "I go where I'm posted, ma'am," I said. "Yes," she said, "you do, and that is exactly why it is the wrong posting, and she knows it, which is why she made it. Don't be modest with me, Corporal, I haven't the patience for it, and neither of us has the time." She glanced back up the avenue toward the lodge. "My brother the king rides north tomorrow evening. He'll be here by dark. I've written to him a long letter by a fast rider that left before dawn. I've told him what his wife is doing to Isolde's children in his house while his back is turned. The will, the lodge, the small daily cruelties, all of it. And I've told him what happened at the boathouse last night as the boy told it to his brother, which is not one word the way the consort has told it. Her mouth thinned. You are not in disgrace, Corporal Thorne. You are the only adult in this house who did the right thing last night, and by this time tomorrow the one man who outranks the consort will know it. So take heart. It turns tomorrow. It all turns tomorrow when Alaric comes. And there you will have felt it. There is the false dawn, the treacherous flat calm the old playbooks warn you of, the moment when it looks one. I felt it myself, standing at that gate. I felt the great weight of it lift a little. The king was coming. Adela had written. The truth was on a fast horse heading north, and by tomorrow dark the man who could set it all right would be under this roof, and Verena would be checked and Morwenna exposed, and the boy given back his lake and his mother's horse and his place at the warm end of the table. Tomorrow. It all turns tomorrow. I have learned to distrust tomorrow. Because here is the thing that a fast letter to a king does, that Adela in her decency did not weigh, and that I, in my momentary relief, did not weigh either. It does not only warn the just. It warns the guilty. Word that the king was riding north, and riding north angry, summoned by his sharp-tongued sister with a letter no one would show her, went through that lodge by noon the way fire goes through gorse. The servants had it. The guests had it. And by afternoon the Queen Consort had it, and she understood, in the cold, quick way she understood everything, exactly what it meant. That her 3 quiet years of work were about to be dragged into the light by the one man she could not manage, and that she had perhaps 2 days, and perhaps less, before the North slipped out of her hands forever and her children with it. I did not see what that did to Morwenna. I was at the gate. But I have pieced it together since, from Adela and from the servants and from the boy, and this is the truth of that long afternoon inside the lodge. The consort, cornered, went hard and fast at her scheme, trying to nail it down before the king came, summoned her lawyers, called for the estate papers, spoke of witnesses, of getting Isolde's settlement declared void that very night so that it would be a settled fact the king arrived to rather than a wrong he could undo. And Verena, her daughter, sat through it all, and heard her mother frightened for the first time in her life, and heard, threaded through the frightened talk, a new note that had never been there before, the note of the losing. For the first time, the Lady Verena watched her mother lose. And she had been raised to believe that a person who was losing was a person who deserved to lose, and she could not bear it, and she went looking, the way she always went looking when she could not bear a thing, for something small and warm and beloved that she could break. She did not have far to look. The little gray ghost had gone down to the water. Torin went to the boathouse that 3rd evening for the reason he always went, because the lodge had become unbearable. The house was full of frightened, angry adults and lawyers, and the crackle of a scheme being nailed down, and the one warm figure who might have shielded him, his Aunt Adela, was locked in a shouting match with the consort over the estate papers, and his brother Rowan had ridden out to meet the king's road and hurry him. So the boy did what a boy does. He slipped the unbearable house and went to the one quiet place he had left, to sit on his mother's bench at the foot of the mere and watch the light go, and he did not tell anyone, because the one man whose whole trade was knowing where he went had been posted that morning to the outer gate to count crows. And Cassius's flighting party had set up at the boathouse an hour before, and gone off up the reeds after the duck, and left, as they left every evening, the rack of spare guns leaning in the boathouse porch, loaded and ready for the next drive, in the corner out of the wind. 4 facts in one ledger: a weeping boy, a skin of false ice, loaded guns unminded at the water's edge. And coming down the path in her fur-collared coat, with her mother's new fear turned to poison in her, a young woman who could not bear to be the one who was losing. I was a half-mile off at the outer gate, and I want to tell you that some fine soldier's instinct brought me down to the water in time, but the truth is plainer and stranger than that, and I have thought about it a great deal, and I have decided that the truth is simply this. I could not stand at that gate. I had stood many hard posts in 11 years and never once left one, and I stood at that gate through the whole cold afternoon, telling myself that the king came tomorrow, and it all turned tomorrow, and my part was to obey and wait. And the sun went down toward the hills, and the light began to fail, and up from the direction of the mere I heard the first flat cracks of the flighting guns rolling across the water, and something in me, the ledger, the arithmetic, 11 years of learning to hear the one wrong note, stood up and would not sit down. I told myself I would only walk to the top of the drive and look. That is what a man tells himself. I walked to the top of the drive and looked, and I could not see the water for the trees, and the light was going, and the arithmetic was screaming now. 4 facts in one ledger, and the king a day away, and the whole house nailing down a scheme. And I thought of Isolde stopping the sergeant from breaking a fainting boy. And I thought of the promise I had made and told no one. And I made the decision that ended my posting at that gate and very possibly saved a life. And I have never for 1 second regretted it. I left my post. A corporal of the household guard walked off the post he had been set and went down through the darkening park toward the mere at a pace that became, before I was halfway, a dead run, my rifle across my chest, my breath tearing, the frozen ground hard under my boots, down through the limes and across the paddock where the gray mare threw up her head at the sound of me, down the long slope toward the black water. And as I ran I heard, over my own breath and the flat far cracks of the flighting guns, a sound that put 10 years of speed into my legs, a child's voice, high and frightened, out on the water side of the boathouse, saying a word I could not make out, and then a woman's voice and a laugh with something broken in it. And then the boy's voice again, and this time I made out the word, and the word was no. I came down the last of the slope into the alders above the boathouse with my heart going like the flighting guns, and I checked, a guardsman checks, even at the dead run, even then. You do not burst into a thing you do not understand. You see it first in the half-second you have, and you choose. And in that half-second, in the last gray light at the foot of the mere, I saw the whole of it, and my blood went to water and then to something colder and steadier than water. The Lady Verena was on the jetty. She had taken one of the loaded guns from the rack in the boathouse porch. A long fowling piece, a heavy thing held wrong, held high and wild across her body the way a person holds a thing they mean to frighten with and do not know how to use. And she was between Torin and the bank, driving him backward down the jetty, out onto the old planks, out toward the water's edge and the skin of false ice beyond it. And the boy was backing away from the swinging muzzle with his hands up and his heels finding the very end of the planks. 1 more step and he was on the ice. 2 more and he was through it into 3 strides of deep cold black water in the dark. And the woman was not aiming the gun so much as brandishing it, wild, past reason, saying something I came in on the end of. See if the little ghost is brave, let's see you be brave, go on, out onto your mother's precious lake. Go on, and the boy took the step he could not help taking back off the planks, and his boot came down on the false ice, and it held for 1 instant and I heard it begin, under his weight, to sing. Here is where a lifetime of standing still pays out all at once, in the space of a breath. I was 30 yards off in the alders. 30 yards is a long way when a boy is going through the ice, and a wild hand is swinging a loaded gun across him in the dark. I could not reach him in time. If I broke from the trees and ran the 30 yards, one of 2 things happened and both of them killed him. Either the boy took his second step onto the deep ice and went through into the black water before I crossed half the ground, or the Lady Verena, startled by a man crashing out of the dark, jerked that heavy fowling piece, held wrong, finger who knew where, and it went off into the boy at 10 feet. Running was death. Shouting was death. A shout would jerk her the same as a rush. Every ordinary thing a man might do was death. There is a thing we are taught, the marksman of the household guard, and taught so long and so hard that it lives below thought, in the hands and the breath. It is called the warning discharge. It is this, that when a life stands in immediate danger and no nearer means will serve, a guardsman may fire a single controlled shot, not at any person, never at any person, but into safe air or safe ground, away from every soul for one purpose only, which is to seize the moment. A gunshot at close range does a thing no shout can do. It stops the world. It freezes every hand and every heart for the half-second the mind needs to understand it. And in ceremonial service, where a warning is meant to save rather than to strike, that stolen half-second is the whole of the art. We drill it 1,000 times. We drill where the muzzle goes, up and off, into empty sky over empty water where no ball can find a living thing. And we drill the breath, and we drill the one clean squeeze, so that on the night it is needed the hands do it without the man having to spend the half-second deciding. My hands did it without me. I had the rifle up and my cheek to the stock, and the muzzle high over the black empty middle of the mere, out over the deep water where there was nothing under the sky but the last of the light. And I let out half a breath the way I had let out half a breath 10,000 times on the range. And between one heartbeat and the next, I fired one shot into the empty air above the lake. The sound of it went across that water like the crack of the world ending. It did what 40 years of drill promised it would do. It stopped everything. The flat, enormous report rolled out over the mere and came slamming back off the far hill, and every living thing at the foot of that lake froze in the half-second of pure animal shock that a gun at close hand hammers into the blood. The duck came up screaming off the far reeds, and Cassius's party a quarter-mile up the water spun round, and the lady Verena, who had been past reason, wild, deaf to any voice, felt that crack go through her like a hand on the back of the neck and jerked bolt upright and stopped, the fouling piece frozen high across her body, her wild face gone slack with the shock of a sound she could not understand, and the boy on the singing ice, froze too, one boot on the black skin and one on the last plank, caught in the same great fist of silence. And into that half-second, the one I had bought, the only one there would be, I moved. I have never crossed 30 yards faster, and I never will again. I came out of the alders and down the bank and out onto the jetty in a handful of strides with the whole of my life bent to two tasks and their order fixed and drilled and clear. The gun first, then the boy. Always the gun first. You do not reach past a loaded weapon in a frightened hand to snatch a child. You take the weapon, and then there is no weapon, and then you have all the time in the world for the child. I hit the end of the jetty and my hand closed over the barrel of the fouling piece, cold iron, high across her body, and I bore it up and away from every living thing, up toward the empty sky, and I turned my wrist and rolled it out of her slack, shocked hands as gently and as absolutely as taking a stick from a sleepwalker, and it was mine, and it was pointed at nothing, and I had the hammer under my thumb, and it was over. The gun was out of the story. It had not fired. It would never fire. No ball but my one clean shot into the empty sky had crossed that water, and that one had found nothing under heaven but air. Then the boy. He had begun to go. In the half-second of frozen silence, his weight had done its slow work, and the false ice under his back boot had given with a soft, wet crunch, and he was tipping, arms wheeling, the black water opening a cold mouth under him, and I dropped the fouling piece safe on the planks behind me, and I went full length along the jetty, flat on the old wood with my arm out over the ice the way you go out over ice, spreading a man's weight, never standing on it, and I caught him. I caught the front of his coat in my fist as his heels went into the water, and I had a rooted grip and a braced body and the strength that comes up out of a man from somewhere below strength when a child is going into cold water in the dark, and I did not so much pull him as fold him up out of it, up and back and along the ice and onto the planks and into the crook of my arm all in one long haul, and then I had him. I had him. Both arms around him, his wet boots and the hem of his coat streaming lake water, his heart going against my chest like a bird's, but out of the water, on the wood, in my arms, safe. "I have you," I said into his hair, and my own voice was not steady and I did not care. "I have you, sir, I told you, never alone at this water. I have you." He did not weep this time. He had gone past weeping into the great shaking quiet that comes after, and he held on to the front of my tunic with both fists and shook. And I knelt on the jetty in the dark and held the late Queen Isolde's son out of the water her death had so nearly given him. And above us on the planks, the Lady Verena sank down all at once with her empty hands over her face and began, at last and too late, to understand what she had done. Then the world came running. Cassius's flighting party first, pounding down the reed path with their guns broken over their arms and their faces white. Then servants with lanterns streaming down from the lodge at the sound of the shot. Then Adela, God bless her forever, out ahead of all the servants with her skirts in her fists and her plain face fierce. And the foot of the mere that had been so still filled up with lantern light and shouting, and the crunch of running boots. And I knelt in the middle of it with the boy in my arms and the loaded fowling piece safe and open on the planks beside me and my own rifle across my back with one round gone. And I did not let go of Torin, and no power at that lake could have made me. Adela reached us first. She went down on her knees on the wet planks without a thought for her coat and took the boy's face in her two hands and looked at him, alive, whole, wet to the knee and shaking but whole. And then she looked at me, one long look over his head, and she did not say anything because there was nothing that needed saying between us just then. She had told me it all turned tomorrow when the king came. It had turned tonight, at the foot of the water, and it had turned on the one man she had watched be posted to the gate. The Queen Consort came down last, with the lawyers. I will give Morwenna this, she did not panic. She came down the lantern-lit path with her chin up and her mind already working, and she took in the scene, her daughter collapsed and weeping on the jetty, the loaded fowling piece open on the planks, the wet and shaking prince in the arms of the corporal she had banished to the gate that very morning, and 100 servants with lanterns for witnesses. And she chose, in the space of 3 steps, the only card she had left, and she played it loud. "He fired on my daughter," she cried, and her voice was made for carrying, and it carried. "The guardsman, he abandoned his post and came here and fired a gun at the Lady Verena in the dark. You all heard it. Seize him. Take that man and hold him for the king." And for one moment, I will not pretend otherwise, the lantern light wavered, and men who did not know what they had run down to find looked from the weeping girl to the armed corporal and were afraid, and a hand or two moved toward me. Because that is how it works in a house where the king is away. The strong write the report. She had written a report at the boathouse 2 nights before and had me sent to the gate for it. And now, over deep cold water, with her own daughter's crime lying open on the planks, she reached for her pen again and began to write the report that would hang me. It was Torin who stopped her. He came up out of my arms. I would have held him, but he came up, wet and shaking, and stood on the jetty on his own 2 feet, small in the lantern light, streaming lake water. And he did the thing his mother would have done. The thing I had told him 2 nights before was the beginning of command. He found the voice that carries without shouting. "He did not fire at her," said Torin, and the lantern steadied because it was the prince who spoke, and the prince had been there. "She took the gun from the porch and drove me out onto the ice. She wanted to see if I was brave. She pushed me out over my mother's lake with a loaded gun, and the ice broke, and I went into the water, and Corporal Thorne fired his shot into the sky, over the water at nothing to make her stop, and it made her stop, and then he took the gun away from her and pulled me out of the lake. He was shaking hard now, but he did not stop. He fired at the sky to save me, and he saved me. And if any man here lays a hand on him, I will remember it every day of my life, and one day I will be grown, and I will still remember." Silence at the foot of the mere, even the consort was silent. And into that silence, up the drive, came the sound of horses ridden hard. It was the king. Rowan, riding out that afternoon to hurry his father's road, had met King Alaric already come north. The king had ridden ahead of his slow baggage, drawn by his sister's letter, and had been not a day away but a few hours, and the crack of a single shot rolling across the evening park had put the spur to the last of it. He came down to the water on a lathered horse with Rowan at his side and his coat flying, and he came into the lantern light and saw his son, wet and standing and alive, and the loaded gun on the planks, and the corporal on his knees, and his wife with her mouth still open on the word seize. And King Alaric of Eldermore took the whole of it in with one sweep of his grey eyes, Isolde's grey eyes. Torin had them from him too, and he did not raise his voice at all. "Someone," said the king, very quietly into the silence, "is going to tell me everything, and they are going to start with why my son is wet." They told him everything. It took most of that night, in the great hall with the fire built up and the whole household summoned, and I will not set down every hour of it, but I will tell you how it came out, because a story owes you its ending. They told him, and there were too many witnesses and too many plain facts for any pen to rewrite. The warning board at the boathouse steps, the rack where the loaded guns had been left unminded 3 evenings running, Cassius's doing, and Cassius stood white and silent through the telling of it, and was the more chastened for having nearly furnished the instrument of a boy's death with his careless sport. The wet hem of the boy's coat, the single spent round in my rifle, and the unfired charge still in the fowling piece. The king's own huntsman broke it open, and showed the hall that the guard's weapon had put one ball into the empty sky, and the lady's weapon had never fired at all, so that the consort's cry of "he fired on my daughter" fell to pieces in front of every servant who had run down to the water. And the boy's account, clear and terrible and simple, and Adela's and mine, given plainly, holding nothing back, including that I had left my post at the outer gate against my orders, which I did not try to soften, because a man who has done right by breaking a rule owes the rule the honesty of naming what he broke. The king heard that part last, and he looked at me a long moment across the firelit hall. "You left the post I am told my wife assigned you this morning," he said. "I did, Majesty," I said. "I was posted to the outer gate and I walked off it and went down to the water. There's no excuse in law for it. There's only the boy, and he's alive, and I'd walk off that gate again tonight if the same voice called across the same water." "Why did she assign you the gate?" said the king. And Adela, before I could find a way to answer that would not accuse the consort in her own husband's hall, said it for me, in her flat true way. "Because 2 nights ago he stopped your wife's daughter tormenting your son at the edge of that same water, brother, and put his coat round the boy, and for that your wife had him march to the gate to count crows. She did not discipline the child who did the tormenting. She disciplined the man who stopped it. And so tonight the man who should have been standing over your son was a half-mile off at the gate, by her arrangement. And it is a mercy past our deserving that his conscience would not let him keep the post she chose for him." The king of Eldermore was quiet for a long time after that, looking into the fire, and the whole hall was quiet with him. And then he did the things a king does, which are slower and heavier than the things a story wants, and I will tell them to you plainly. He upheld the late Queen Isolde's settlement whole and entire, that very week, before he did anything else. The lodge, the lands, the grey mare's paddocks, the jewels, all of it confirmed upon Isolde's 3 children past any lawyer's clouding, and the men Morwenna had brought north dressed as guests were sent home with their contracts torn. "My first wife's word will stand in this house while I am alive to make it stand," he said, "and after, because I will write it so that no one can unwrite it." So the thing Morwenna had schemed 3 years to take was lost to her in a single night, not by cleverness, but by the plain light of what her own daughter had done at the water. He did not destroy the Lady Verena, and I have come in the years since to think the better of him for it, though there were those who wanted her destroyed. He named plainly what she had done, that she had taken a loaded weapon and driven a child of 11 out onto breaking ice over deep water, and that a boy was alive that night by a hand's breadth and a guardsman's aim and nothing else. And he did not let one soft word be spoken to lessen it. But he saw, as I had seen at the paddock, that here was a young woman broken in the making, taught cruelty at the knee of a mother who called it strength, and he judged that the answer to a person made wrong was not to break her further, but to take her out of the hands that had made her. He removed her from the household and from the court entire, and placed her far away in the sober, plain living care of the Princess Adela's own household in the West, under Adela's cool, honest eye, to be kept from harm and perhaps in time, unmade from what she had been made and mended into something better. Whether it took, I cannot tell you. That is a longer story than mine, and I was not there for it. But I have heard, years on, that the Lady Verena keeps horses now gently, and does not raise her hand to them, and I have chosen to believe it. As for the Queen Consort Morwenna, the king did not put her aside. A king's marriage is a matter of state, and not a thing undone in a fire-lit hall in a night. But he broke her grip on his house as surely as I had broken the moment at the water. She was sent from Ravenshallow before the week was out and kept thereafter to the southern palaces, her stewards replaced, her hand taken off the ordering of Isolde's children, and the Princess Adela given standing over the young ones that no letter of Morwenna's could ever again undo. The strong had written the reports in that house for 3 years. The king came home, and after that night the strong wrote nothing. And me. The king sent for me alone, the second morning, in the small oak parlor where I had once stood in a doorway holding a lamp and heard a scheme laid out over a fire. He was standing at the window when I came in, looking down the park toward the water, and he did not turn round at once. "The captain tells me," he said, "that you knew my first wife, long ago." "Once, Majesty," I said. "For an hour. I doubt she'd have remembered it. She stopped them breaking me when I was a fool of 19 and sent me to the marksman. Everything I am because of that hour." "So the hand that put the ball in the sky over my son," said the king slowly, "was a hand my first wife steadied 11 years before there was a son to save." He turned round then, and his gray eyes were wet, and he was not ashamed of it. "There are those at court who would call that chance, Corporal. I am not one of them. I think a good woman's kindness travels further through this world than she ever lives to see, and lands sometimes on a jetty in the dark, 11 years on, in exactly the hand it is needed in. I think Isolde saved my son that night. I think she did it through you." I could not answer him. I am a plain man, and there was nothing in me plain enough to say. He put it right, all of it, in the way that a king can. There was no charge for the abandoned post. Instead, the record was made to read that Corporal Emrys Thorne had, on the night in question, acted to preserve the life of a prince of the blood with a discipline and a judgment that honor the whole household guard, and the warning discharge examined and set down, plainly and forever, as rightly and lawfully fired. A single controlled shot, sent into empty air over open water, at no living soul, for the sole and successful purpose of arresting a mortal danger to a child when no nearer means could serve. No one had been touched by it. No one had been meant to be. That was written into the record in the king's own hand, so that it could never be unwritten, and I have a copy of it still, and it is the thing I am proudest of in a life with a good deal of standing still in it. And he gave me back the boy. Not the outer gate, the boy. I was posted, by the king's own word and for as long as I cared to hold it, to the personal guard of the young Prince Torin, at no proper distance at all, and I held that post for 6 years, until he was grown and needed a man beside him less and a friend in the world more, and by then we were the second, and I count it the great good fortune of my life. I will end where a guardsman's story ought to end, which is at his post. The last thing I want to set down is a small thing that happened a week after, when the fright had gone out of the house, and the king had ridden south again, and the north had settled back into its own gray quiet. It had frozen hard, and the whole of the mere lay under good thick ice now, safe ice, the treacherous early skin grown solid and sound, and one bright cold afternoon Torin asked me to walk down to the water with him. We went, the boy and the man, down past the paddock where the gray mare Fen, his now, past all lawyers, his forever, put her head over the rail to watch us go, and out along the bank to his mother's boathouse and the jetty where it had all so nearly ended. He stood a while and looked at the water. Then he picked up a flat stone from the bank, the way she had taught him in that one shared summer, and he sent it skipping out across the ice. 1, 2, 3, 4 skips, ringing off the frozen surface and away into the reeds, and he watched it go, and he said, not to me exactly, but out over the water. She said the mere was the oldest quiet thing she knew. "It's quiet now, sir," I said. "It's quiet now," he said. And then he looked up at me, the late Queen's gray eyes steady in the cold, bright light, no longer red-rimmed, no longer a ghost's, and he said, "You talked about her, when no one else would. You told me the dead have the people they mended." "They do, sir." "Then she has a great many," said Torin, "because you mended me. And one day I'll be grown, and I'll mend someone, and they'll mend someone, and it'll go on, won't it? It'll go on and on from her forever." "It will, sir," I said, and I found my throat was tight and I did not care. "That's exactly how it goes, that's the whole of it." And we stood together at the foot of the mere in the clean cold, the boy and the man, at no proper distance at all, and watched the light move on the good thick ice the way she had loved to watch it, and I did not stand still because I was posted to. I stood still because there was nowhere in the whole wide world I would rather have been standing, and no one I would rather have been standing beside, and because the quiet at that water was, at last, the right kind of quiet, the oldest kind, the kind she'd meant, and a guardsman learns, if he is lucky, to know the one from the other, and to guard it with his life.